The lawyer's voice crackled through the phone like static electricity. "Mr. Harrison, I need you to understand what you're asking me to do here." I shifted the phone to my other ear, the hospital bed creaking beneath me. Through the window, Chicago's skyline blurred in the October rain, each droplet on the glass distorting the city I'd spent 43 years calling home. "I understand perfectly, Janet. I want to change my will, tonight." "But David, your family." "My family." I laughed, and it came out bitter as burnt coffee. "Where exactly is my family right now, Janet? Can you tell me that?" The silence on the other end stretched long enough for me to count the beeps of the heart monitor beside my bed. 68 beats per minute, slower than it should be, according to Dr. Martinez. But then again, everything about me was slowing down these days. "I'll be there in 2 hours, Janet finally said. "But David, your family." "My family," I laughed, and it came out bitter as burnt coffee. "Where exactly is my family right now, Janet? Can you tell me that?" The silence on the other end stretched long enough for me to count the beeps of the heart monitor beside my bed. 68 beats per minute, slower than it should be, according to Dr. Martinez. But then again, everything about me was slowing down these days. "I'll be there in 2 hours, Janet finally said. I hung up and stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the water stains. 47. I'd had plenty of time to count them over the past 3 days, alone in this sterile room that smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken promises. 3 days since the diagnosis. 3 days since I'd called my wife, my kids, my brother. 3 days of excuses and silence. The door opened, and Nurse Patricia wheeled in with my evening medications. She was the only constant face I'd seen since arriving, a 50-something black woman from Louisiana who didn't sugarcoat anything. "Your dinner's getting cold," she said, nodding toward the untouched tray on the bedside table. "Not hungry." "Mm-hmm." She checked my IV drip with practiced efficiency. "That lawyer friend of yours coming by tonight?" I nodded. Patricia had a way of knowing things without being told. It was probably written all over my face, the kind of desperate determination that only comes when you realize you've been living your life for people who wouldn't cross the street to spit on you if you were on fire. "You sure about this, honey?" She pulled up the chair beside my bed, something she never did during her regular rounds. Sometimes folks need time to process bad news. Doesn't always mean they don't care. 3 days, Patricia. 72 hours. Sarah said she'd call back after her yoga retreat in Sedona. Derek's got midterms at Northwestern. Can't make it down from Evanston. Might as well be on Mars. My brother Mike? He's swamped with his construction business. I made air quotes with fingers that felt heavier than they should. You know what swamped means in October in Illinois? It means he's hunting season drunk somewhere in Wisconsin. Patricia nodded slowly. "What about your baby girl? Rachel, right?" The mention of my youngest daughter's name hit me like a punch to the gut. Rachel, 22 and fresh out of college, had been the one I'd counted on, the one who still called me Daddy instead of David or Dad, the one who'd inherited my stubborn streak and my late mother's soft heart. She's in San Francisco now, big tech job. Says she can't get time off during her first quarter. I picked at the hospital blanket, trying to keep my voice steady. Apparently, launching some app is more important than this. This being? I gestured vaguely at the machines surrounding me, at the pale yellow gown that made me look like a dying canary. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 to 8 weeks, maybe 10 if I'm lucky and the treatment works, which it probably won't. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the rain had picked up, drumming against the window like impatient fingers. Somewhere down the hall, a television was playing a Cubs game from earlier in the season. October baseball. Postseason dreams that had died months ago. Just like everything else in my life. 43 years old, I continued, not sure if I was talking to Patricia or just to the room. You know what I was doing at 22? Working 60-hour weeks at the plant, saving every penny for Sarah's engagement ring. Took me 8 months to afford the one she wanted. Real diamond, not some cubic zirconia bullshit. I wanted her to know she was worth the real thing. And now? Now she's finding herself through hot yoga and meditation retreats that cost more than I used to make in a month. I laughed again, and this time it came out raw. Funny how money changes people. Or maybe it just reveals who they really were all along. I'd built Harrison Construction from nothing. Started with a pickup truck, a toolbox inherited from my old man, and enough stupid courage to bid on jobs I had no business taking. 20 years of 16-hour days, missed dinners, skipped vacations, and canceled plans. All so my family could live in a house with a 3-car garage in Naperville, so my kids could go to good schools, so Sarah could drive her BMW to her book club meetings where they discussed novels about women who felt trapped by their comfortable lives. The irony wasn't lost on me. Patricia stood up, smoothing down her scrubs. Well, honey, I can't tell you what to do with your money, but I can tell you that death has a way of making people show their true colors. Sometimes it ain't pretty, but at least you know where you stand. She was right. I knew exactly where I stood now, alone in a hospital bed, rewriting a will that had originally left everything to people who couldn't be bothered to show up for my dying. After Patricia left, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. 43 years on this earth, and my phone held maybe 24 numbers I actually recognized. Half of them were business contacts who'd probably delete my number the moment they heard I was sick. The other half were family members who'd already made their priorities clear. I stopped at Derek's name. My oldest boy, 24, and supposedly studying business at Northwestern. The kid I'd coached in Little League, taught to drive, walked through his first heartbreak. The same kid who'd asked me for a loan just 6 months ago to cover his spring break trip to Cancun. $5,000 so he could get drunk on beaches with his fraternity brothers. I'd written the check without hesitation. My finger hovered over his name, then moved on. What was I gonna say? Hey son, your old man's dying? How about putting down the textbooks for a weekend and pretending you give a damn? No, I'd already played that card. Left 3 voicemails that had gone unreturned. The door opened again, and this time it was Dr. Martinez, 40-something, tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The kind of guy who'd probably gone into medicine thinking he'd save lives and cure diseases, only to spend most of his time delivering death sentences to middle-aged men who'd worked themselves into early graves. How are we feeling tonight, David? Like shit warmed over, Doc, but I'm guessing you didn't come here to discuss my emotional state. He pulled up the same chair Patricia had used, consulting the tablet in his hands. Your latest blood work came back. The numbers aren't great, but they're not worse than expected. The oncologist wants to start chemotherapy on Monday if you're up for it. What are my odds? With treatment, maybe we can buy you a few more months. The cancer's aggressive, but what are my odds? I repeated. Dr. Martinez set down his tablet. Honestly, 5% chance you see Christmas. Maybe 15% if everything goes perfectly with the chemo. I nodded. At least he wasn't blowing sunshine up my ass like some doctors did. And without treatment, 4 to 6 weeks, maybe 8 if you're stubborn. I'm definitely stubborn. He smiled for the first time since I'd met him. Yeah, I got that impression. So, what do you want to do? I thought about it. Really thought about it. 6 months of chemo, puking my guts out, losing what was left of my hair, getting weaker and sicker for the slim chance of seeing another spring. And for what? To die surrounded by the same empty room and paid staff? I need some time to think about it. Of course. But David, he leaned forward, don't wait too long. If you want to fight this thing, sooner is better than later." After he left, I lay there in the growing darkness, listening to the sounds of the hospital around me. Nurses walking the halls in soft-soled shoes, the distant ding of elevator doors, someone crying in a room down the hall. This wasn't how I'd imagined my life would end. When I was younger, stupider, I'd pictured myself as an old man surrounded by grandchildren, telling stories about the good old days when men built things with their hands and families stuck together through thick and thin. I'd imagined Sarah holding my hand, gray-haired and still beautiful, whispering that she loved me as I drifted off to whatever came next. Instead, I was dying alone at 43, surrounded by strangers who were paid to keep me comfortable, while my family lived their lives a safe distance away. My phone buzzed. A text message from Sarah. "Talk to Dr. Martinez. This is all so sudden. Need more time to process. The retreat is helping me find clarity. We'll call soon. Love you." Find clarity? Jesus Christ. I scrolled up through our message history. The last real conversation we'd had was 3 weeks ago, and it was about property taxes. Before that, it was about Derek's tuition payment. Before that, Rachel's car insurance. When had we stopped talking about anything that mattered? When had our marriage become nothing but a business arrangement between two people who happened to share a mortgage? I knew the answer, even if I didn't want to admit it. It had been gradual, like cancer itself, a slow erosion of everything that had once felt solid and permanent. Sarah had started spending more time with her friends, going to her classes, finding herself in expensive ways. I'd thrown myself deeper into work, telling myself I was providing for my family when, really, I was just avoiding the growing silence in my own house. The kids had picked up on it, of course. Kids always do. Derek had become distant and entitled, treating me like an ATM with legs. Rachel had moved across the country the day after graduation, claiming she needed space to figure out her own life. Even my youngest, who used to crawl into bed with Sarah and me on Sunday mornings, had learned to keep her distance from the Cold War that had replaced our marriage. Another text, this time from Derek. "Dad, heard you're sick. That sucks. I've got finals coming up, but maybe I can drive down next weekend if you're still in the hospital." If I'm still in the hospital, like this was a minor inconvenience that might resolve itself by next weekend. I turned off the phone and threw it on the bedside table harder than I meant to. The sound echoed in the small room, and for a moment I felt embarrassed by my own anger. But then I remembered Patricia's words. At least now I knew where I stood. The truth was, I'd been dying long before the cancer. I'd been dying for years, working myself to death for people who'd learned to see me as a resource rather than a person. The diagnosis hadn't changed anything. It had just put a timeline on what was already happening. I thought about my father, dead 15 years now, from a heart attack at 58. He'd worked construction too, back when it was all union jobs and steady pay. He'd come home every night, covered in dust and concrete, wash up in the kitchen sink, and sit down to dinner with my mother and Mike and me. We'd talk about school, about baseball, about whatever was happening in the neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. When had I stopped being real? I remembered the exact moment, actually. Rachel was 12, and she'd asked me to help her with a science project about the solar system. I'd been on my phone, dealing with some crisis at a job site, and I told her to ask her mother. The look on her face, disappointed but not surprised, had haunted me for years. It was the moment I realized I'd become the kind of father I'd sworn I'd never be. But I told myself it was temporary, just until the business got established, just until we paid off the house, just until the kids got through college. Always just until. Now there was no more until. There was only now and a few weeks of now if I was lucky. The door opened, and Janet walked in carrying a leather briefcase and looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. Janet Morrison had been my lawyer for 8 years, ever since Sarah and I had bought the house in Naperville. She was competent, professional, and expensive. Exactly what I'd wanted when I was building an empire I thought would last forever. David? She set down her briefcase and looked around the room like she was taking inventory. Are you sure about this? Because what you're asking me to do, it's going to have consequences. I'm dying, Janet. Everything has consequences now. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. I brought the original will so we can go through it item by item. But first, I need to ask, have you told your family about these changes? What's to tell? They've made their position clear. David, people react to terminal illness in different ways. Sometimes they need 3 days. I held up 3 fingers. 72 hours. My wife is too busy finding herself to find her way to my deathbed. My son can't be bothered to drive 30 miles to see his dying father. My daughter thinks her tech job is more important than saying goodbye. And my brother, Christ, I don't even know where Mike is right now. Janet pulled out a pen and set it on the rolling table beside my bed. Okay, let's go through this. The original will was simple enough. Everything to Sarah, with provisions for the kids if she predeceased me. The house, the business, the life insurance, the retirement accounts, all of it designed to keep my family comfortable after I was gone. I'd even included a trust fund for future grandchildren I'd probably never meet. I want to change all of it, I said. All of it? Every goddamn word. Janet looked uncomfortable, but she was too professional to argue. What did you have in mind? I'd been thinking about this for 3 days straight, lying in this bed with nothing but time and anger for company. The house goes to Patricia Rodriguez. The nurse? She's been here every day, checking on me, making sure I'm comfortable, talking to me like I'm a human being instead of a medical chart. She's got 3 kids and works double shifts to make ends meet. You know where she lives? A 2-bedroom apartment in Pilsen that probably costs half her salary. Janet scribbled notes. David, that's very generous, but the business goes to my foreman, Tony Castellanos. He's been with me for 12 years, knows every aspect of the operation. He's the one who actually runs the jobs while I sit in an office pushing paper around. His wife just had their 4th kid, and he's been hoping to start his own company someday. What about your family's financial security? I laughed, and this time it came out almost cheerful. You mean their BMW payments? Their private school tuitions? Their yoga retreats and spring break trips and whatever other bullshit they've convinced themselves they need? Janet set down her pen. David, I understand you're hurt, but you're talking about disinheriting your wife and children. Are you really prepared to do that? Was I? I looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, at the city where I'd spent my adult life building something I'd thought would matter. The rain had stopped, and the lights of downtown reflected off the wet streets like scattered diamonds. Let me ask you something, Janet. When you go home tonight, will your husband ask you about your day? Of course. Will he listen to the answer? She nodded. When you're sick, does he bring you soup? When you're worried about something, does he notice? When you need help, does he help? Yes, but that's what a family is supposed to be. People who show up. People who give a damn whether you live or die. I pointed to my phone on the bedside table. I've got a phone full of people who call themselves my family, and not one of them could be bothered to show up when it mattered. Janet was quiet for a long moment. So, what do you want to leave them? I'd thought about this too. Sarah gets $10,000, enough for a nice funeral and maybe a weekend retreat to process her grief. Derek gets $5,000, about what he asked me for last spring. Rachel gets $5,000 too, since she's apparently too busy launching her career to launch a relationship with her dying father. And your brother. Mike gets my truck and my tools. That's what Dad left me, and it's all Mike ever really wanted anyway. Janet looked at her notes. That leaves the bulk of your estate unaccounted for. The life insurance alone is worth $500,000. I've been thinking about that too. I shifted in the bed, trying to find a position that didn't make my back ache. Split it between 3 charities. St. Jude Children's Hospital, because kids shouldn't have to go through this shit. The American Cancer Society, obviously. And this was the part I was most proud of. Chicago Trades Academy. They train kids from rough neighborhoods to work construction, plumbing, electrical work. Real jobs that actually build something. You're essentially giving away over $1 million to strangers. No, I'm giving it to people who matter. There's a difference. Janet finished writing, then looked up at me. I have to ask this, and please don't take offense. Are you on any medications that might affect your judgment? Painkillers, anxiety medication? Just the standard stuff. I'm dying, Janet, not delusional. I know exactly what I'm doing. She nodded and pulled out a fresh legal pad. Okay, let's draft this thing. We worked for 2 hours, going through every detail, every contingency. Janet was thorough. I had to give her that. She made sure I understood the implications of every decision, the legal challenges my family might mount, the tax consequences of my choices. By the time we finished, it was almost midnight. The hospital had gotten quieter, the night shift settling into their routines. Janet packed up her papers and promised to have everything properly drawn up by morning. "David," she said as she prepared to leave, "I'm obligated to tell you that you can change this will again anytime you want. If your family, if circumstances change, they won't." After she left, I lay there in the darkness, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not peace, exactly, but a kind of righteous satisfaction. For the first time in a long time, I'd made a decision based on what felt right, rather than what was expected of me. My phone had been buzzing periodically throughout the evening. More texts from Sarah about processing and clarity. A voicemail from Derek saying he might be able to visit this weekend if things worked out. Nothing from Rachel or Mike. I turned the phone face down and closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I'd have to decide about the chemotherapy. Whether to spend my last few weeks fighting a battle I couldn't win, or to accept what was coming and try to make the most of whatever time I had left. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt like I'd accomplished something worthwhile. I'd taken back control of the only thing I had left, my legacy. And I was giving it to people who deserved it. The next morning, Dr. Martinez found me sitting up in bed, working on a laptop Patricia had borrowed from the nurse's station. I was writing letters, explanations for Patricia and Tony about their inheritance, instructions for the charities, and yes, letters to my family explaining why I'd made the choices I'd made. "You look better today," he said, checking my chart. "I feel better, clearer. Have you thought about the treatment options?" I saved my work and closed the laptop. "I have. I want to start chemo as soon as possible." He looked surprised. "That's great, David. What changed your mind?" I thought about it. The truth was, I wasn't fighting for more time with my family. That ship had sailed. I was fighting for more time to see if the new will would make a difference. More time to see if my final act of rebellion might wake up the people I'd spent my life caring about. I guess I realized I've got more to live for than I thought. Dr. Martinez smiled. "That's the attitude that beats this thing. When can you start? How about today?" The first chemo session was scheduled for that afternoon. Patricia had volunteered to stay late and sit with me, since the treatment could take several hours and the side effects were unpredictable. "You sure about this, honey?" she asked, as the nurse prepared the IV drip. "This stuff's gonna make you feel worse before it makes you feel better." "I'm sure." As the chemicals began flowing into my bloodstream, I felt a strange mixture of hope and resignation. Maybe the treatment would work. Maybe I'd get a few more months, or even years. Maybe my family would come around once they realized I was serious about fighting. Or maybe not. Maybe I'd spend my last weeks puking my guts out while my wife found clarity in Arizona and my kids found excuses to stay away. Either way, I'd done what I could. I'd made my choices based on what mattered to me, not what was expected of me. The will was signed, the letters were written, and my legacy was secure. 2 hours into the treatment, my phone rang. It was Derek. "Dad, I heard you started chemo today. That's good, right? That means you're fighting this thing? His voice sounded different, younger, more like the kid I remembered from Little League games and camping trips. Yeah, son, I'm fighting. Look, I know I should have come down sooner. I was scared, you know? I didn't know what to say. For the first time in days, I felt my throat tighten with something other than anger. You don't have to say anything, Derek. Just be here. I'm driving down tonight, after my last class. I'll be there by 9. Okay, I'll be here. After I hung up, Patricia squeezed my hand. See, sometimes people surprise you. Maybe she was right. Maybe Derek's visit would lead to visits from Rachel and Sarah. Maybe my family would rally around me, the way families were supposed to during crises. Or maybe Derek would show up tonight, stay for an hour, and disappear back into his life at Northwestern. Maybe this was just guilt manifesting as temporary concern. It didn't matter. I'd made my peace with the situation. If my family wanted to be part of my life during whatever time I had left, they were welcome. But I wouldn't beg for their attention anymore. I wouldn't sacrifice my dignity for their comfort. The chemicals continued flowing into my veins, and I closed my eyes, thinking about the future I'd bought myself. Not the future I'd planned, but the one that was actually possible. A few months, maybe more, to see if the people I'd spent my life loving could learn to love me back. And if they couldn't, well, at least Patricia would have a house, Tony would have a business, and kids somewhere would get the medical care they needed because a dying construction worker had decided to give his money to people who mattered. Derek arrived at 8:30, clutching a bag from Portillo's and looking older than his 24 years. He'd driven through Chicago traffic in the rain, and his hair was still damp when he walked into my room. "Brought you a beef sandwich," he said, setting the bag on the bedside table. "I know the hospital food sucks." I hadn't eaten much in days, but the smell of the Italian beef made my stomach growl for the first time since the diagnosis. "Thanks, kid." He pulled up the visitor's chair and sat down, looking around the room like he was seeing it for the first time. "This place is depressing." Yeah, well, dying isn't exactly a party. We ate in comfortable silence for a while. The sandwich tasted better than anything I'd had since arriving at the hospital, and Derek seemed relieved to have something to do with his hands. "Dad," he said, finally, "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I was being a coward." "We're all cowards sometimes, son. The important thing is showing up when it matters." "Is it working? The chemo?" "Too early to tell, but I'm gonna fight this thing as hard as I can." Derek nodded, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. "Good, because I need more time with you. We need more time." "We've got time now. However much there is, we've got it." Over the next 3 hours, we talked more than we had in years. About his studies, his girlfriend, his plans after graduation. About my business, my regrets, my hopes for whatever time I had left. About the distance that had grown between us and how we might bridge it. It wasn't a miracle. Derek was still the same entitled kid who'd asked me for money to fund his spring break trip. I was still the same workaholic father who'd missed too many important moments. But it was a start. When visiting hours ended, Derek promised to come back the next day. And I'm gonna call Rachel and Mom. They need to be here too. Only if they want to be, Derek. I'm done begging people to care about me. He looked confused by that statement, but he nodded anyway. "They'll come. I'll make sure of it." After he left, I lay awake thinking about the letters I'd written earlier. One for Derek, explaining why I'd initially cut him out of the will and why I might reconsider if he proved he could be the man I'd hoped he'd become. One for Rachel, telling her how proud I was of her success, but how much I missed having her in my life. One for Sarah, documenting 20 years of marriage and asking her to remember the good times along with the disappointments. Maybe I'd give them the letters. Maybe I'd revise the will again if they proved they could stick around for more than a guilt-driven visit or two. Or maybe I'd let things stand as they were. Maybe the knowledge that they'd lost their inheritance would teach them something about taking people for granted. Either way, I was at peace with my choices. For the first time in years, I was living my life on my own terms instead of trying to meet everyone else's expectations. The chemo made me sick for the next 2 days. Patricia stayed with me through the worst of it, holding a basin while I puked up everything I'd eaten and some things I hadn't. She talked me through the nausea, the headaches, the bone-deep fatigue that made everything feel impossibly heavy. "This is the worst part," she kept saying. "Gets easier after the first few treatments." I hoped she was right, because if this was what fighting looked like, I understood why some people chose to let the cancer win. Derek came back both days, bringing books and magazines and more food from home. He'd called Rachel, and she'd promised to fly in from San Francisco as soon as she could get time off work. He'd also talked to Sarah, who was cutting short her retreat to come home and reassess the situation. "What about Uncle Mike?" Derek asked on the third day. "I called him," I said. "Left another message. Haven't heard back." Derek's jaw tightened. "That's bullshit, Dad. You're his brother. Mike's got his own problems. Always has." But I was hurt by my brother's absence more than I wanted to admit. Mike and I had grown up sharing a bedroom in a 2-bedroom house on the South Side. We'd learned to work construction together, following our father to job sites during summer breaks. When I'd started my own company, Mike had been my first employee. Somewhere along the way, we'd drifted apart. Mike had gotten divorced, started drinking too much, become unreliable. I'd had to let him go from the company 5 years ago, and our relationship had never recovered. He'd moved up to Wisconsin, bought a rundown cabin near Lake Superior, and we'd barely spoken since. But he was still my brother, and I was still dying. On Thursday morning, Rachel walked into my room carrying a bouquet of flowers and looking like she'd been crying for hours. She was thinner than I remembered, dressed in the kind of expensive casual clothes that marked her as successful and urban. But her eyes were red-rimmed, and when she saw me lying in the hospital bed, she broke down completely. "Daddy," she sobbed, and suddenly she was my little girl again, crawling into my lap after a nightmare or a scraped knee. I held her while she cried, stroking her hair and telling her everything would be okay, even though we both knew it might not be. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I should have come sooner. I was scared, and I thought you'd be okay. You're always okay." "I'm okay now," I said. "You're here now." Rachel had taken a leave of absence from her job, something I thought was impossible according to her earlier excuses. She'd booked a hotel room near the hospital and planned to stay indefinitely. "What about your career?" I asked. "Fuck my career," she said, and the profanity sounded strange coming from my youngest daughter. I almost lost my father because I was worried about impressing people who don't give a shit about me. Over the next few days, Rachel became my primary caregiver, coordinating with the medical staff, researching treatment options online, and generally taking charge of my care in a way that reminded me why I'd always been so proud of her. She also asked difficult questions. "Dad, why didn't you tell us how serious this was? When you called, you made it sound like something that could wait." I thought about that. Had I downplayed the diagnosis? Maybe. I'd spent so many years protecting my family from worry that I'd gotten in the habit of minimizing problems. "I guess I didn't want to scare you," I admitted. "Well, we're scared now, and we're here." Sarah arrived on Friday, looking tan and centered from her yoga retreat, but also genuinely shaken by my appearance. The chemo had taken its toll over the past week. I'd lost weight, my skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and my hair was starting to thin. "Jesus, David," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You look like shit, I know. Like you're really sick." For the first time since our marriage had started falling apart, Sarah looked at me like she used to. Not like a problem to be managed or a provider to be leveraged, but like a person she cared about. "I am really sick, Sarah. That's what I've been trying to tell you." She took my hand, and her touch felt familiar in a way that made my chest tight. I know. I'm sorry. I needed time to process, but I should have processed here, with you. That weekend, for the first time in months, my family gathered around my hospital bed like families do in movies. Derek brought his girlfriend, a sweet kid named Amy, who worked as a nurse at a pediatric clinic. Rachel read to me from a novel she'd loved. Sarah held my hand and talked about our early years together, when we'd been broke and happy and sure we could conquer the world together. It felt like a reprieve. Not from the cancer, that was still there, still growing, still killing me slowly, but from the loneliness that had been eating at me for years. On Sunday evening, after everyone had gone back to their hotels and apartments, I pulled out the letters I'd written, the angry hurt letters explaining why I'd disinherited them, the detailed explanations of their failures as a family. I read them over, remembering the fury and disappointment that had inspired them. Then, I tore them up and threw them in the trash. Janet called on Monday morning. "How are you feeling? You sounded different on the phone." "Better, stronger." "Good. I've got the revised will ready for your signature. Do you want me to bring it by this afternoon?" I thought about it. My family had shown up. They were trying. Derek was visiting every day. Rachel had essentially moved to Chicago to be near me, and Sarah was talking about couples counseling and working through our problems. But I also remembered the 3 days I'd spent alone, counting ceiling tiles and wondering if anyone would miss me when I was gone. I remembered the years of distance, the gradual erosion of everything I'd thought was solid. People could change, but they could also change back. "David, are you there?" "I'm here. Yeah, bring the will by. I want to sign it." "Are you sure? Because if your family situation has improved..." "The will stands, Janet. My family is here now, and I'm grateful for that. But I learned something important over the past few weeks. I learned who I can count on when everything goes to hell, and I want my legacy to reflect that." That afternoon, I signed the new will with Derek and Rachel in the room. I didn't tell them what was in it. That would be a conversation for later, if there was a later. I just wanted them to know that I was taking care of business, making sure everything would be handled properly after I died. "What's in it?" Rachel asked. "Provisions for everyone I care about," I said, which was technically true. Dr. Martinez came by that evening with the results of my latest blood work. The chemo was working, slowly, marginally, but working. The tumors had stopped growing, and some of the smaller ones had actually shrunk. "I'm not ready to use the word remission," he said, "but this is the best possible outcome we could have hoped for at this stage. What does that mean in terms of time? If this continues, could be a year, maybe more. A year. 12 months to rebuild relationships I'd thought were irreparable. 12 months to see if my family's newfound attention was real or just crisis-driven. 12 months to decide whether the new will was justice or revenge." That night, Sarah slept in the chair beside my bed instead of going back to her hotel. She'd done this every night since returning from Arizona, claiming the chair was comfortable enough. Really, I think she was afraid I'd die in my sleep and should miss the chance to say goodbye. "David," she whispered in the darkness, I know things have been difficult between us. We both made mistakes, Sarah. I want to fix this. I want us to fix this." I reached over and took her hand. "We've got time now. However much there is, we've got it." She squeezed my fingers. "I love you. I know I haven't shown it well lately, but I do love you. I love you too." And I did. Despite everything. Despite everything. The years of growing apart, the silence that had replaced conversation, the way we'd both stopped trying. I still loved the woman I'd married 22 years ago. The question was whether love would be enough to rebuild what we'd let fall apart. Over the next few weeks, as my body slowly adapted to the chemotherapy regimen, my family settled into new routines. Derek drove down from Northwestern every Tuesday and Thursday, spending the afternoon doing homework in my room while I dozed between treatments. Rachel had found a temporary apartment in Lincoln Park and was working remotely for her tech company, something she'd sworn was impossible just a month earlier. Sarah moved back into our house in Naperville but spent most of her days at the hospital. We talked, really talked, for the first time in years. About the business, about the kids, about how we'd both contributed to the distance between us. "I felt invisible," she admitted one afternoon while I was between chemo sessions. "Like I was just part of the household infrastructure, the person who handled school events and grocery shopping and made sure everyone had clean clothes." "I felt like a machine," I said. "A machine that generated money and solved problems and fixed whatever was broken, but never got asked what I needed or wanted." When did we stop being partners? I thought about it. Probably around the time Derek started high school. You got busy with your activities, I got busy with work, and we just forgot to check in with each other. It wasn't a revelation that would fix everything overnight, but it was a start. For the first time in years, we were acknowledging the problems instead of pretending everything was fine. The business was running smoothly under Tony's supervision. He came by the hospital twice a week to go over the books and discuss ongoing projects, but mostly he just wanted to check on my health. "You don't look like you're dying anymore," he said one Thursday afternoon, settling his bulk into the visitor's chair that creaked under his weight. "Chemo's working, slowly but working." "Good, because I got news." He grinned and pulled out his phone, showing me pictures of a house. A nice house, actually. 4 bedrooms in a good neighborhood near his kid's school. Maria found it. We put in an offer yesterday. "That's great, Tony. You can afford that?" "With the raise you gave me last month and Maria's promotion at the bank, yeah, we can swing it." He looked embarrassed. "First time in my life, I'll own something bigger than a pickup truck." The raise he was referring to was substantial. I'd bumped his salary by 30% and made him an official partner in the business. It was part of my preparation for either dying or being too sick to work, but it was also long overdue recognition for a man who'd been carrying more than his share of the load for years. "You deserve it," I said. "You've earned it." What I didn't tell Tony was that if my health continued to improve, he'd earn a lot more than a raise. The new will still stood, and Harrison Construction would still go to him when I died. But now, instead of being motivated by anger and disappointment, the decision felt like the right thing to do regardless of my family situation. On a Thursday in mid-November, Mike finally showed up. I was dozing after a particularly rough chemo session when I heard a familiar voice in the hallway arguing with one of the nurses. "I don't give a damn about visiting hours. That's my brother in there, and I drove 8 hours through a fucking snowstorm to see him." The door opened, and Mike shuffled in, looking like he'd been living rough for months. His hair was longer and grayer than I remembered, his clothes were rumpled, and he smelled like he'd been sleeping in his truck. But his eyes were clear, clearer than I'd seen him in years. "Jesus, Davy, you look like hammered shit." "Good to see you too, Mike." He pulled up the chair and sat down heavily. "Sorry I didn't come sooner. Had some things to sort out." "Things?" "Got sober. 93 days today." He pulled a poker chip out of his pocket, the kind they give you in AA meetings. "Figured I should get my head straight before I came to say goodbye to my baby brother." I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. "You're not here to say goodbye. The chemo's working." "Yeah? How much time you got?" "Maybe a year, maybe more if I'm lucky." Mike nodded slowly. "Good. Gives us time to fix some things." We talked for 2 hours, about his drinking, about the resentment he'd carried since I'd fired him from the company, about the guilt I'd carried for choosing business over family, about our father, dead 15 years, but still influencing the way we related to each other, about the cabin in Wisconsin where Mike was slowly rebuilding his life one day at a time. "I want to make amends," he said finally. "That's step 9. I want to make amends for being a drunk asshole who let you down when you needed me." "You're here now." "Yeah, but I should have been here weeks ago, when you first called." He looked out the window at the early November snow that was starting to stick to the glass. I was too proud and too scared to face the fact that my little brother was dying. "I'm not dying anymore, Mike. Not anytime soon, anyway." "Maybe, but you could have been, and I would have missed the chance to tell you that I'm sorry for being such a fuck-up, and that I'm proud of what you built, and that I love you, even though I'm shit at showing it." When visiting hours ended, Mike promised to come back the next day. "And I'm going to stick around Chicago for a while. Maybe see if Tony's got any work for an old construction hand who's trying to get his life back together." After he left, I sat in the darkening room thinking about forgiveness. How hard it was to give, how much harder it was to accept. Mike had been absent when I needed him most, but he was here now. My family had failed me in my darkest hour, but they were trying to make up for it. The question was whether their presence now could erase their absence then. Dr. Martinez came by on Friday with more good news. The latest scans showed continued improvement. Several tumors had shrunk significantly, and there were no new growths anywhere in my body. "I'm still not ready to use the R word," he said, "but if this continues, we might be looking at a long-term survival situation."
What's long-term? 5 years, maybe 10, maybe more. We just don't have enough data on cases like yours to know for sure. 5 to 10 years. Long enough to see grandchildren if Derek and Amy ever got serious. Long enough to rebuild my marriage if Sarah and I could figure out how to be partners again. Long enough to watch Rachel build her career and maybe find someone who deserved her. Long enough to revise my will again if my family proved they'd learned something from this experience. That weekend, Sarah and I had our first real fight since my diagnosis. Not about money or schedules or who was supposed to pick up the dry cleaning, but about us. About what we wanted our marriage to look like if I survived this thing. "I don't want to go back to the way things were," she said. We were sitting in the hospital cafeteria, picking at sandwiches that tasted like cardboard. "I was miserable, David. We both were." "So what do you want?" "I want a husband who comes home at night and asks about my day. I want to be a wife who cares about the answer when she asks about yours. I want us to travel together and talk about things that matter and remember why we fell in love in the first place. And if I can't change, if work is still the most important thing in my life?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Maybe we should talk about what comes next." It wasn't an ultimatum exactly, but it was close. The message was clear. Survival wasn't enough. If I wanted to keep my family, I had to be willing to change the patterns that had driven us apart in the first place. That night, I lay awake thinking about the choices in front of me. I could fight to get back to my old life, 60-hour work weeks, missed dinners, and the gradual accumulation of wealth and resentment. Or I could use this second chance to build something different. The next morning, I called Tony and asked him to come in for a meeting.
"I want to make you a full partner," I said when he arrived. 50-50 split of ownership, decision-making authority, everything. Tony stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "Boss, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do. If I'm going to beat this thing, I need to stop working myself to death. And if I don't beat it, you need to be in position to keep the company running without missing a step." "What about your family?" "My family will be fine. They don't need the business. They need me to be present and healthy and engaged with their lives. This way, I can afford to step back from day-to-day operations and focus on what really matters." We spent the afternoon working out the details with Janet, who looked relieved that I was making decisions based on hope rather than anger. The partnership agreement would take effect immediately, with Tony buying out half my stake over the next 5 years. It was a generous deal for him, and a smart one for me. It guaranteed the company's future while giving me the financial freedom to prioritize my health and family. It also meant I could revise my will without feeling like I was giving away my children's inheritance out of spite. Tony would eventually own the whole company anyway, whether I died next year or in 20 years. On December 1st, exactly 8 weeks after my diagnosis, Dr. Martinez used the word we'd all been waiting to hear: Remission, he said, setting down my latest test results with a smile. Complete remission. I want to keep you on a maintenance chemo regimen for another 6 months, but as of today, there's no detectable cancer in your body. The celebration was quiet. Sarah crying in the bathroom, Rachel calling everyone she knew, Derek bringing champagne to the hospital room, even though I couldn't drink it with the medications I was on. Mike showed up with a bouquet of flowers he'd obviously bought from the hospital gift shop, and Tony brought the entire crew by to shake my hand and tell me they'd known I was too stubborn to die. Patricia, who'd been covering extra shifts to stay close to my case, squeezed my hand and whispered, "I told you that first night, you had more to live for than you thought." That evening, after everyone had gone home and the hospital had settled into its quiet night routine, I pulled out the copy of my will that Janet had given me weeks earlier. The will that left everything to people who'd shown up when it mattered, while my family got token amounts and lectures about taking people for granted. I read through it one more time, remembering the anger and hurt that had motivated every word. Then I picked up my phone and called Janet. "I want to revise the will again," I said. "David, it's 9 o'clock at night." "I know, but I'm in remission, Janet, complete remission, and I want to fix some things while I still can." The new will was simpler and more generous. Sarah got half of everything, not because she deserved it after abandoning me during my darkest hours, but because she was trying to rebuild our marriage, and I wanted to meet her halfway. The kids got equal shares of the remainder, with trust funds that would pay out over time as they proved they could handle the responsibility. Patricia still got the house. That decision stood regardless of my family situation. She'd earned it by being present when no one else was. Tony kept his 50% of the business, which was now official partnership rather than inheritance. The charities got smaller amounts, but still substantial donations that would make a difference in other people's lives. "This is much more conventional," Janet said when we finished the revisions, "more in line with what most people would expect." I'm feeling more conventional these days, more hopeful. What I didn't tell Janet was that I'd also written a letter. Not the angry screed I'd composed during my darkest days, but a thoughtful explanation of what I'd learned about family, loyalty, and forgiveness during my brush with death. The letter would go to Sarah, Derek, and Rachel along with the will whenever that day came. In it, I'd tried to capture the complexity of loving people who disappoint you and being disappointed by people you love. I'd written about the difference between holding grudges and holding standards, about the importance of showing up even when it's difficult or inconvenient. Most importantly, I'd written about second chances, how rare they are, how precious they are, and how easy they are to waste if you're not careful. Christmas came early that year. Not the holiday itself, but the feeling of Christmas. The sense that impossible things could happen, that broken relationships could be repaired, that hope was stronger than disappointment. Sarah and I spent our first Christmas Eve in years actually talking to each other, instead of just managing the logistics of the holiday. Derek brought Amy home to meet the family officially, and it was clear they were serious about each other. Rachel had decided to move back to Chicago permanently, taking a job with a smaller tech company that offered better work-life balance. Mike stayed sober and started working for Tony, proving that old construction hands could learn new tricks if they wanted to badly enough. I was officially in remission, officially cancer-free, officially lucky as hell. But I never forgot those 3 days in the hospital when I thought I was going to die alone. I never forgot the lesson about who shows up when everything falls apart and who finds excuses to stay away. My family had earned their way back into my life and my will, but they'd done it the hard way. Through months of proving they could be present, reliable, and genuinely caring instead of just going through the motions. The original will, the angry one that would have left them almost nothing, stayed in my safe at home, not as a threat, but as a reminder. A reminder that love without presence is just sentiment, that family is something you do rather than something you are, and that the people who matter most are the ones who show up when showing up is hard. On New Year's Eve, as 2026 began, I stood on the deck of our house in Naperville, looking out at the snow-covered yard where my kids had played as children. Sarah was inside, preparing for the party we were hosting, the first party we'd thrown together in years. Derek and Amy were coming, along with Rachel and her new boyfriend. Mike was driving down from Wisconsin, 6 months sober and looking healthier than he had in years. Tony and his family would be there, along with Patricia and her kids. It was going to be crowded and chaotic, and exactly the kind of evening I would have avoided a year ago, when work was more important than relationships, and I measured success by the size of my bank account rather than the number of people who cared whether I lived or died. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Running late but will be there by 8. Can't wait to celebrate with everyone." A year ago, that text would have annoyed me. Tonight, it just made me smile. I was 44 years old, cancer-free, and surrounded by people who'd proven they deserved to be in my life. My business was thriving under Tony's partnership. My marriage was stronger than it had been in years. My kids were building lives I could be proud of. Most importantly, I'd learned the difference between earning love and demanding it, between being present and just being there. The original will was locked away, hopefully never to be needed. But the lessons that had inspired it, about loyalty, presence, and the courage to hold people accountable for how they treat you, those lessons were part of me now. As I headed back inside to join my family and friends, I thought about Patricia's words from that first night. "You have more to live for than you thought." She'd been right, but not in the way either of us had imagined. I didn't have more to live for because my life was already full of meaningful relationships. I had more to live for because I'd finally learned how to build them. The party was everything I'd hoped it would be. Loud, messy, and full of people who genuinely wanted to be there. Sarah laughed at my stories. Derek and Amy announced their engagement. Rachel made everyone cry with a toast about second chances and the importance of family. Mike stayed until midnight, sober and present, and more like the brother I remembered from our childhood than he'd been in 20 years. As the clock struck 12 and 2026 officially began, I kissed my wife and hugged my children and felt grateful for something I'd almost lost through my own stubbornness and their neglect. Not just my life, but my family. Not just my wealth, but my relationships. Not just my legacy, but my love. It had taken a terminal diagnosis to teach us all how to be present for each other. It had taken the threat of death to teach us how to live. But we'd learned, and we'd survived, and we had years ahead of us to practice what we'd learned. The will in my safe would stay there, gathering dust and serving as a reminder of how close we'd all come to losing what mattered most. The new will, the one that reflected hope rather than hurt, would hopefully stay unneeded for decades to come. Either way, I was at peace with my choices. I'd fought for my life and won. I'd fought for my family and won that too, though it had taken all of us changing in ways we hadn't expected. As the party wound down and our guests headed home through the snowy Chicago night, I stood in my living room, surrounded by the debris of celebration, empty glasses, crumpled napkins, the comfortable chaos of people who genuinely enjoyed being together. Sarah was loading the dishwasher, humming something under her breath. Derek and Amy were curled up on the couch, making quiet plans for their future. Rachel was helping clean up, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. It wasn't perfect. We still had work to do, all of us. Sarah and I were still learning how to be partners again, instead of just roommates managing a household. Derek was still growing into the kind of man I hoped he could become. Rachel was still finding the balance between ambition and relationships. But it was real, it was present, it was earned. And for the first time in years, I was looking forward to tomorrow.